The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Corporal Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet and checked her rifle one final time. At 23 years old, she had already completed 2 tours in Iraq, but something felt different about this patrol. The intelligence reports had been unusually quiet, which in a city like Fallujah meant trouble was brewing beneath the surface. Sarah's unit, Bravo Company, had been tasked with conducting a routine sweep of the Al Anbar district, searching for weapons caches and gathering intelligence on insurgent activities. The neighborhood had been relatively calm for the past few weeks, giving the local population a chance to rebuild and return to some semblance of normal life. Children had started playing in the streets again, and merchants were slowly reopening their shops. As the convoy of armored vehicles rolled through the narrow streets, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her combat instincts, honed by months of urban warfare, kept her alert and scanning every rooftop, every doorway, every pile of debris that could potentially hide an enemy fighter. The other Marines in her squad shared similar concerns, their conversations subdued and their weapons at the ready. The mission briefing had been straightforward enough. Intelligence suggested that a high-value target, a bomb maker responsible for several devastating attacks on coalition forces, was operating somewhere in the district. Their job was to gather information, identify potential safe houses, and report back to headquarters. It was supposed to be a standard reconnaissance mission, the kind they had performed dozens of times before. Sarah's squad leader, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, had emphasized the importance of maintaining good relations with the local civilians. The Hearts and Minds campaign was just as crucial as the military operations, and every interaction with Iraqi citizens could either help or hinder their overall mission. Sarah took this responsibility seriously, having learned enough Arabic to communicate basic needs and show respect to the local population. As they dismounted from their vehicles and began their foot patrol, Sarah noticed an elderly Iraqi man watching them from his doorway. She offered a respectful nod, which he returned with a slight smile. These small moments of human connection reminded her why she had joined the Marines in the first place. She believed in protecting innocent people and helping rebuild a country torn apart by war. The patrol moved methodically through the neighborhood, checking identification cards, asking questions about suspicious activities, and documenting anything that seemed out of place. Sarah's team was responsible for covering the eastern section of the district, which included a maze of narrow alleyways and single-story buildings that provided perfect cover for ambush attacks. About 2 hours into the patrol, they received a radio call reporting unusual activity near an abandoned school building. Local residents had seen armed men moving equipment into the structure during the night, and coalition forces needed to investigate. Sarah's squad was the closest unit to the location, so they were tasked with conducting the initial reconnaissance. As they approached the school, Sarah felt her heart rate increase. The building showed clear signs of recent occupation, with fresh tire tracks in the dirt and scattered cigarette butts near the entrance. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called for backup and established a perimeter while they prepared to enter the structure. Sarah checked her ammunition and tested her radio communication one final time. The school's courtyard was eerily quiet, with broken glass crunching under their boots as they moved toward the main building. Sarah took point position, her training taking over as she scanned for potential threats. The windows were boarded up, but she could see small gaps where light filtered through, suggesting that someone had been using the building recently. Just as they reached the main entrance, a shot rang out from somewhere inside the building. The bullet struck the concrete wall inches from Sarah's head, sending fragments of debris flying. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez immediately called for everyone to take cover and radioed for additional support. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding as she tried to determine the shooter's position. What happened next would change Sarah's life forever. As insurgent fighters opened fire from multiple positions within the school, Sarah found herself caught in the deadliest firefight of her military career. The peaceful morning patrol had suddenly transformed into a desperate battle for survival, and Sarah Mitchell was about to face the greatest test of her courage and determination. The gunfire erupted from 3 different positions simultaneously, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned down Sarah's squad in the open courtyard. She dove behind a concrete barrier, feeling the heat of bullets passing inches from her body. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the school's walls. creating a deafening cacophony that made communication nearly impossible. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was shouting orders over the radio, calling for immediate air support and additional ground units. Sarah could see two of her fellow Marines, Corporal Jackson and Private Martinez, trapped behind a damaged vehicle about 30 feet away. Every time they tried to move, bursts of gunfire forced them back into cover. The insurgents had clearly planned this ambush carefully, using the school's layout to their advantage. Sarah assessed her position and realized she had a clear line of sight to one of the shooters' positions on the second floor of the building. She adjusted her rifle scope and waited for the muzzle flash that would reveal the exact location of her target. When the insurgent fired his next burst, Sarah squeezed the trigger and watched through her scope as the figure fell backward into the room. The victory was short-lived, however, as more fighters appeared at different windows. Intelligence estimates had suggested 3 or 4 insurgents, but Sarah could count at least 7 distinct firing positions. They had walked into a much larger operation than anyone had anticipated. The weapons cache they were investigating was apparently being guarded by a significant number of well-armed fighters. Private Martinez attempted to move to a better position but was immediately targeted by multiple shooters. Sarah watched in horror as her teammate stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder where a bullet had found its mark. Corporal Jackson tried to reach Martinez, but the intensity of the gunfire made any movement across the open ground virtually impossible. Sarah made a split-second decision that would define her character for the rest of her life. Despite the overwhelming enemy fire, she left her protected position and sprinted across the courtyard toward her wounded comrade. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet and shattered concrete near her head, but she kept running. Her only thought was reaching Martinez and getting him to safety. She slid into cover next to the wounded Marine, immediately applying pressure to his shoulder wound while scanning for the next move. Martinez was conscious but losing blood, and they needed to get him medical attention quickly. The nearest safe position was a storage building about 50 meters away, but crossing that distance under fire seemed impossible. Corporal Jackson provided covering fire as Sarah prepared to carry Martinez to safety. She hoisted the wounded Marine onto her back and began the dangerous journey across the exposed courtyard. Each step felt like an eternity as bullets whistled past her ears and struck the ground around her feet. Her legs burned with the extra weight, but she pushed forward with determination born from months of combat training. Halfway to safety, Sarah felt a sharp pain in her left leg as a bullet grazed her thigh. She stumbled but managed to keep moving, driven by pure adrenaline and the knowledge that Martinez's life depended on her reaching cover. Jackson continued to lay down suppressive fire, his accurate shooting forcing some of the insurgents to duck for cover. Just as they reached the storage building, Sarah felt another impact, this time in her right arm. The bullet passed through the muscle without hitting bone, but the pain was intense and her grip on Martinez began to weaken. She managed to get him behind the concrete wall of the building before collapsing from exhaustion and blood loss. Jackson reached their position moments later, having made his own dash across the deadly courtyard. He immediately began treating both wounded Marines while calling for medical evacuation on his radio. The gunfire continued from the school building, but their current position provided excellent protection from the insurgent shooters. Sarah forced herself to remain conscious and alert despite her injuries. She reloaded her rifle and prepared to continue fighting if necessary. The pain in her leg and arm was manageable, and she knew that more enemy fighters might try to flank their position. Her military training had taught her that wounded Marines were still capable of fighting as long as they could hold a weapon. Over the radio, they could hear the approaching sound of helicopter rotors as air support finally arrived on scene. The distinctive thump of rotor blades grew louder as Apache attack helicopters moved into position to engage the insurgent fighters. Sarah felt a wave of relief knowing that help was finally arriving, but she also knew the battle was far from over. The insurgents had proven to be well-trained and heavily armed, suggesting this was more than just a random weapons cache. Sarah began to suspect they had stumbled into a major insurgent stronghold, possibly the headquarters of the bomb maker they had been hunting. If that was true, the intelligence value of this location was enormous, but so was the danger they still faced. The Apache helicopters circled overhead like mechanical birds of prey, their pilots coordinating with ground forces to identify targets without risking friendly fire. Sarah could hear the distinctive whine of their chain guns spinning up, preparing to unleash devastating firepower on the insurgent positions. However, the close proximity of her squad to the enemy fighters made precision strikes extremely dangerous. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had managed to establish communication with the helicopter pilots and was directing their attention to the school's upper floors where the majority of enemy fire was originating. Sarah watched through her rifle scope as the lead Apache positioned itself for an attack run, its weapon systems locked onto the building where insurgents continued to fire at her trapped squad. The first missile strike hit the school's eastern wing with tremendous force, sending debris and dust clouds billowing across the courtyard. The explosion was so powerful that Sarah felt the concussion wave wash over her position, temporarily deafening her and filling her mouth with grit and dust. Several windows in nearby buildings shattered from the blast, and car alarms began wailing throughout the neighborhood. When the dust settled, the gunfire from that section of the building had ceased, but insurgents in other parts of the structure continued their assault. Sarah realized that some of the fighters had moved to interior positions, where the helicopters couldn't target them without destroying the entire building and potentially causing massive civilian casualties in the surrounding area. Corporal Jackson was applying fresh bandages to Martinez's shoulder wound when they heard the distinct sound of rocket-propelled grenades being fired from the school. 2 RPGs streaked across the courtyard, one passing harmlessly over their heads while the other struck a parked vehicle and exploded in a fireball of twisted metal and burning fuel. The insurgents were escalating their resistance, using heavier weapons that posed a serious threat to the helicopters. Sarah forced herself to focus despite the pain from her wounds and the disorienting effects of the nearby explosions. She noticed movement in the school's main hallway through a damaged window and realized that insurgent fighters were repositioning themselves to establish new firing positions. Her combat experience told her that they were probably planning a coordinated counterattack to break out of the building. Over the radio, she could hear frantic communications between various military units as additional forces rushed to the scene. A full company of Marines was en route, along with explosive ordnance disposal teams and medical personnel. However, Sarah knew that it would take at least 20 minutes for significant reinforcements to arrive, and her small squad needed to hold their position against a determined enemy. The intensity of the gunfire suddenly increased as more insurgent fighters joined the battle. Sarah counted muzzle flashes from at least 12 different positions, indicating that this was indeed a major enemy stronghold rather than a simple weapons cache. The fighters were well coordinated and disciplined, suggesting they had received professional military training, possibly from foreign sources. Martinez was drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss. Despite Jackson's efforts to stabilize his condition, Sarah realized that they needed medical evacuation immediately, but the landing zone was still too dangerous for a rescue helicopter to approach. The insurgents would need to be eliminated or forced to retreat before any medical aircraft could safely enter the area. Sarah made another difficult decision. Despite her own injuries, she volunteered to provide covering fire while Jackson carried Martinez to a more secure position further from the school building. The storage facility where they had taken cover was still within range of enemy small arms fire, and they needed to establish a safer perimeter for the incoming medical team. As Jackson prepared to move Martinez, Sarah noticed that the insurgent fire was becoming more accurate and concentrated. The fighters had apparently identified their exact position and were focusing their efforts on eliminating the 3 Marines. Bullets began striking the concrete walls around them with increasing frequency, sending chips of debris flying through the air. Sarah positioned herself at the corner of the building where she could observe the school while providing maximum protection for her wounded comrade. She had 4 magazines of ammunition remaining, which needed to last until reinforcements arrived. Every shot had to count, and she began engaging targets with careful, deliberate fire rather than the rapid suppression shooting she had used earlier. Through her rifle scope, Sarah could see individual insurgent fighters moving between rooms in the school building. Their faces were covered with traditional scarves, but their movements and tactics suggested they were experienced combat veterans rather than hastily recruited local fighters. This realization made her understand that they had stumbled into something much larger than a routine patrol mission. The sound of additional helicopters approaching from the north indicated that the cavalry was finally arriving. Sarah could distinguish the deeper rotor noise of transport helicopters, mixed with the higher-pitched whine of more attack aircraft. The full weight of American military power was being brought to bear on this single building. But she knew the real battle was just beginning. As she prepared for what she sensed would be the climactic phase of the firefight, Sarah reflected on the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. A routine patrol had transformed into a life-or-death struggle that would test everything she had learned about courage, loyalty, and survival in combat. The reinforcements arrived, just as the insurgents launched their coordinated breakout attempt. Sarah watched in amazement as nearly 20 fighters emerged from various exits of the school building simultaneously, carrying automatic weapons and explosive devices. Their plan was clearly to overwhelm the small Marine squad through sheer numbers and firepower, then escape into the maze of neighborhood streets before additional forces could surround them. Sarah opened fire immediately, targeting the insurgents who posed the greatest threat to Jackson and Martinez. Her first shots dropped 2 fighters who were attempting to flank their position from the left side of the courtyard. The remaining insurgents spread out and began using cover and concealment tactics that demonstrated their professional training and combat experience. The newly arrived Apache helicopters engaged the escaping fighters with devastating effect, their chain guns cutting down several insurgents who had made it into the open street. However, many of the fighters had anticipated air support and quickly moved into buildings where the helicopters couldn't target them without risking civilian casualties. The urban environment provided numerous hiding spots and escape routes that favored the defending insurgents. Sarah realized that some of the fighters were moving directly toward her position, using a series of concrete barriers and abandoned vehicles as cover. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they would be close enough to use grenades or automatic weapons at point-blank range. Her ammunition was running low, and she needed to make every shot count in what was becoming a desperate last stand. Jackson had successfully moved Martinez to a more protected location behind a thick concrete wall, but now he was trapped there by intense crossfire from multiple directions. Sarah could see muzzle flashes from insurgent weapons getting closer to her position with each passing second. The sound of gunfire was so intense that she could barely hear her own thoughts, let alone radio communications from other units. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, Sarah heard the distinctive crack of sniper rifles from elevated positions around the battlefield. Marine Scout snipers had arrived and were engaging targets from rooftops and upper-story windows throughout the neighborhood. Their precision fire began eliminating insurgent fighters one by one, targeting those who posed the most immediate threat to the trapped Marines. The tide of battle began to turn as more ground forces arrived and established a proper perimeter around the school building. Sarah could see Marines moving through the streets in coordinated teams, clearing buildings and cutting off escape routes that the insurgents had planned to use. The professional response demonstrated the effectiveness of Marine training and tactics when properly coordinated. However, the insurgents were far from defeated. Several fighters had managed to reach positions close enough to Sarah's location to throw hand grenades. She watched in slow motion as a fragmentation grenade bounced off a nearby wall and rolled toward her feet. Training took over as she dove away from the explosive device, feeling the concussion and shrapnel as it detonated behind her. The explosion knocked Sarah unconscious for several seconds, and when she regained awareness, she realized that shrapnel had struck her in multiple places. Her left shoulder burned with intense pain, and she could feel warm blood flowing down her back and arms. Despite her injuries, she forced herself to maintain her fighting position and continue engaging enemy targets. Through blurred vision and ringing ears, Sarah could see that Jackson was attempting to reach her position while dragging Martinez to safety. More insurgent fighters were converging on their location, apparently recognizing that the 3 Marines represented isolated targets that could be eliminated before reinforcements arrived. Sarah knew she had to buy them time, even if it meant sacrificing her own safety. She expended her remaining ammunition in a series of carefully aimed shots, dropping 3 more insurgent fighters who were advancing on Jackson and Martinez. When her rifle clicked empty, she drew her sidearm and prepared for close-quarters combat. The pain from her multiple wounds was becoming overwhelming, but her determination to protect her fellow Marines kept her conscious and fighting. The sound of approaching Marine infantry could be heard getting closer as the relief force fought their way through the neighborhood toward her position. Sarah counted at least 4 distinct firefights happening simultaneously throughout the area, as Marines engaged insurgent fighters who were attempting to escape or establish new defensive positions. The battle had expanded far beyond the original school building. Sarah's vision was becoming increasingly blurry from blood loss and shock, but she could see several insurgent fighters advancing on her final defensive position. She had 6 rounds remaining in her pistol and was prepared to fight to the end to protect her wounded teammates. The thought of her family back home flashed through her mind, but she pushed away any doubts about her duty and responsibility. Just as the insurgents reached throwing distance for their grenades, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of Marine assault rifles opening fire from behind the advancing fighters. The relief force had finally broken through the insurgent defenses and was engaging targets throughout the courtyard. Sarah allowed herself a moment of hope that they might actually survive this nightmare, but she knew the most dangerous part of the battle was still ahead. The final phase of the battle unfolded with terrifying intensity, as the insurgent fighters made their last desperate attempt to inflict maximum casualties before being overrun. Sarah watched through increasingly blurred vision as several fighters armed with suicide vests emerged from the school building, running directly toward the approaching Marine positions. Their plan was clear: cause mass casualties among the relief force and create enough chaos to allow the remaining insurgents to escape. Sarah tried to warn the advancing Marines about the suicide bombers, but her voice was too weak and the gunfire too loud for anyone to hear her shouts. She raised her pistol with trembling hands and managed to fire 3 rounds at the nearest bomber, striking him in the leg and causing him to stumble. The wounded fighter continued his charge but was ultimately brought down by Marine rifle fire, just seconds before reaching his intended target. The explosion from the suicide vest was tremendous, creating a crater in the courtyard and showering the entire area with debris and dust. Sarah felt the concussion wave wash over her already battered body, causing additional damage to her eardrums and leaving her completely disoriented. For several minutes, she lost consciousness entirely, collapsing behind the concrete barrier that had protected her throughout the firefight. When Sarah regained awareness, the sounds of battle had diminished significantly. She could hear individual rifle shots and shouted commands, but the intense automatic weapons fire had largely ceased. Through the settling dust and smoke, she could see Marine uniforms moving through the area, securing the battlefield and treating wounded personnel. The immediate danger appeared to be over, but Sarah was too weak to call out for help. Corporal Jackson had managed to signal the rescue teams and was directing them toward Sarah's position while continuing to provide medical care for Martinez. The wounded Marine was stable, but needed immediate surgical attention to repair damage from the gunshot wound to his shoulder. Sarah could see medical personnel setting up a casualty collection point near the storage building where Jackson had taken cover. Navy corpsmen reached Sarah's position and immediately began assessing her injuries. She had sustained 14 separate wounds from bullets, shrapnel, and debris during the extended firefight. Most were relatively minor, but several had caused significant blood loss and tissue damage. The corpsmen worked quickly to stop the bleeding and stabilize her condition for medical evacuation. Sarah tried to speak but found that her throat was too dry and damaged from dust and smoke to form coherent words. The corpsman understood her attempts to communicate and assured her that both Jackson and Martinez were alive and receiving medical treatment. Hearing this news gave Sarah the strength to remain conscious as the medical team prepared her for transport to a field hospital. The casualty evacuation helicopter arrived within minutes, its rotor wash clearing away much of the dust and debris that filled the air around the battlefield. Sarah was loaded onto a stretcher and carried toward the aircraft alongside Martinez and 2 other wounded Marines from the relief force. Through the helicopter's windows, she could see the school building burning in several places, with thick black smoke rising into the desert sky. During the flight to the field hospital, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as medical personnel worked to maintain her vital signs and prevent shock from setting in. She could hear radio communications describing the scope of the battle and the intelligence value of the captured insurgent stronghold. Apparently, the school had been serving as a major bomb-making facility and weapons storage depot for insurgent operations throughout the region. The medical team at the field hospital moved with practiced efficiency as they received the wounded Marines from the helicopter. Sarah was rushed into surgery to repair damage from the most serious of her wounds, while other doctors worked simultaneously on Martinez and the additional casualties from the firefight. The hospital staff had extensive experience treating combat injuries and knew exactly how to prioritize care for multiple wounded patients. Sarah's surgery lasted nearly 4 hours as doctors, removed shrapnel fragments, and repaired damaged muscle tissue in her shoulder, arm, and leg. The medical team was amazed that she had remained conscious and continued fighting, despite sustaining so many wounds. Her determination and physical conditioning had literally saved her life by preventing her from going into shock during the extended battle. When Sarah finally awoke in the recovery ward, she found Jackson sitting beside her bed with his arm in a sling. He had sustained minor wounds during the final phase of the battle, but had refused medical evacuation until all of his teammates were safely out of the combat zone. His loyalty and dedication exemplified the Marine Corps values that had sustained them all through the nightmare they had survived. Jackson told Sarah that Martinez was recovering well and would make a full recovery from his shoulder wound. More importantly, the intelligence gathered from the school building had led to the capture of several high-value targets and the disruption of a major insurgent network operating throughout the Fallujah area. Their sacrifice had saved countless lives by preventing future terrorist attacks on both coalition forces and Iraqi civilians. As Sarah processed the full scope of what they had endured, she began to understand that their survival was nothing short of miraculous. The firefight had lasted over 3 hours against overwhelming odds, and they had prevailed through a combination of training, courage, and determination that defined the best of the American military. However, Sarah knew that the most challenging part of her journey was still ahead. 2 days after the battle at the school, Sarah was resting in her hospital bed when she heard the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching the medical facility. Through her window, she could see a sleek black aircraft landing on the hospital's helipad. Different from the standard military helicopters she was accustomed to seeing, several figures in distinctive uniforms emerged from the aircraft and walked purposefully toward the hospital entrance. Navy doctor entered Sarah's room, accompanied by a tall man wearing the trident insignia of a Navy SEAL. The SEAL introduced himself as Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thompson and explained that he was leading a special operations team tasked with following up on the intelligence gathered from the school building. Sarah's heroic actions during the firefight had not only saved her teammates but had also provided crucial information about insurgent operations in the region. Commander Thompson explained that the bomb-making materials and documents recovered from the school had revealed the location of the insurgent network's primary headquarters. This facility was believed to house the leadership structure responsible for coordinating attacks throughout central Iraq, including the bomb maker who had been their original target. The intelligence was time-sensitive, as the insurgents would likely relocate their operations once they learned of the school's capture. What made this mission particularly significant was that one of the captured insurgents had revealed information about American prisoners being held at the headquarters facility. 2 soldiers who had been missing for over a month were believed to be alive and imprisoned in the basement of the target building. The SEAL team was planning an immediate rescue operation, but they needed additional intelligence about the facility's layout and defensive positions. Sarah was surprised to learn that her tactical observations during the firefight had provided valuable insights into insurgent tactics and capabilities. Her detailed report about their weapons, training level, and coordination had helped intelligence analysts understand that they were dealing with a sophisticated enemy force rather than local militia fighters. This information was crucial for planning the rescue mission's approach and tactics. Commander Thompson asked Sarah if she would be willing to provide additional details about the insurgent fighters she had observed, despite her injuries and need for rest. Her first-hand experience with their combat techniques could help the SEAL team anticipate potential resistance and plan countermeasures. Sarah agreed immediately, understanding that her information could save the lives of captured American soldiers. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked with intelligence specialists to create detailed profiles of the insurgent fighters she had encountered. Her observations about their movement patterns, communication methods, and weapons handling provided insights that would prove invaluable for the upcoming mission. Despite her physical condition, Sarah's mind remained sharp and focused on helping her fellow service members. The SEAL team departed that evening for their mission, carrying with them the intelligence that Sarah and her squad had paid such a high price to obtain. Sarah watched their helicopter disappear into the darkness, knowing that somewhere in the dangerous streets of Fallujah, American soldiers were counting on the success of this rescue operation. Her sacrifice and that of her teammates had set in motion events that could save multiple lives. 3 days later, Commander Thompson returned to the hospital with news of the mission's outcome. The SEAL team had successfully rescued both American prisoners and eliminated the insurgent leadership structure that had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition forces. The rescued soldiers were alive and recovering, though they had endured significant hardship during their captivity. Sarah felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that her actions had contributed to saving the lives of fellow Americans. The pain from her wounds seemed less significant when measured against the knowledge that her sacrifice had made a real difference in the war effort. She began to understand that heroism wasn't about individual glory, but about the willingness to risk everything for the safety and freedom of others. The medical staff informed Sarah that she would be transferred to a hospital in Germany for additional treatment and rehabilitation. Her wounds were healing well, but she would require several months of physical therapy to regain full use of her injured arm and shoulder. The doctors were confident that she would make a complete recovery and could return to active duty if she chose to do so. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her recovery, she reflected on the events that had transformed her from a routine patrol Marine into a combat veteran who had faced the ultimate test of courage and determination. The firefight in Fallujah had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would influence the rest of her life and the lives of the people she had helped save. Jackson and Martinez visited Sarah before her departure, both recovering well from their own injuries. The three Marines had formed an unbreakable bond through their shared experience, understanding that they had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature in a single afternoon. Their friendship would endure long after their wounds had healed and their military service had ended. Sarah's story became an inspiration throughout the Marine Corps, demonstrating that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when faced with impossible circumstances. Her 14 wounds had become symbols of courage and sacrifice, reminding everyone that freedom comes at a price that brave men and women are willing to pay. The SEALs who had come for her intelligence had completed their mission, but Sarah's real victory was the knowledge that she had lived up to the highest ideals of military service.